welcome to What's Your Story? My guest tonight is Nora Howard. She is a historian and writer. She has written several books and articles. Among them are Catched on Fire, a story about a man's 50-year journal, Avon, nationwide town history series of vintage photographs, Stories of Wethersfield, Wethersfield Post, Avon Life, and West Hartford Life, over 100 historical articles, Historical Journal of Massachusetts. Nora has quite an impressive record of volunteer service to communities, which include Avon, Congregational Church Historian, United Church of Christ, Historical Committee for Connecticut, Fishers Island, New York, Union Chapel, Pastoral Search, Avon Historical Society, Executive Director, First Church of Christ, Wethersfield, Historian, Wethersfield Historical Society, Executive Director, and she was a Smithsonian employee working as a museum technician. Her duties as the historian for the Avon Congregational Church, which is about to celebrate its 200th anniversary, brings her here tonight. Welcome to the show, Nora.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
Well, it's a pleasure. I was looking forward to this interview for quite a while because I interviewed you at your lovely church and fell in love with it. So I want to share some of that 200-year history with our viewing audience tonight. Okay. When Avon Congregational Church was founded in 1818, the country was just 31 years old. James Monroe was president, and there were only 21 states at the time. There is an interesting story of exactly how this church came into being. It separated itself and morphed into different churches. Would you please share that story with our audience?
I'm happy to.
Thank you.
Our church in Avon, it had one church, and it was founded in 1751. And over the decades, as the population grew, and there was a river going through the town, or the parish, so that made it hard for some people to get to the church. They, over several decades, decided that they wanted two churches. And the General Assembly got involved. There were decades of voting and bad feelings and sort of challenges of where did everybody really want to go. And then on a December night in 1817, the church mysteriously burned down.
Oh.
And there was a notice in the Hartford Courant saying, if you know anything about this, let us know. And then subsequent writings pointed a little finger at the pastor, perhaps, which I do not agree with.
Okay, all right.
So that left a burned down church and a congregation of several hundred. Where would they go to church now? So over the next few months, they had a vote and they split in two. The majority went to the west and built the West Avon Congregational Church. I am historian of the other church, the minority, who went to what is today Route 44.
Yes.
And built that iconic New England meeting house right on the corner. And it was completed in 1819.
Okay, right.
So there we have it, two churches.
Wow, out of one.
Out of one.
Yes.
And today we are friends again.
So you're friends?
We are.
So did it take that long to mend the rift? Or?
Well, we've been friends for a long time. But in 1817, 18, there were some very emotional feelings and anger and disappointment and sadness.
Has your research told you what the source of the anger? Was it over the content of the worship, or what was it?
I think it was geography.
Geography? Because the river would run.
Well, it was where we want it in our neighborhood. We don't want to have to go, 2 miles north
2 miles in 1819 was 2 miles.
It was a lot.
Yes.
Why do you get it in your neighborhood? We should have it in ours.
Oh, okay.
And that just it really festered for about 20 years before the fire.
Just people being people.
People being people. And the pastor at that point, he'd been pastor for almost 50 years.
Oh my goodness.
And there is a sense that people weren't as happy with him anymore. And so that added to the
turmoil.
And the sense of let's have a change.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, the famous architect David Hoadley designed the church, but who actually built the church? Noting that slavery was legal during this period, do you have any records of exactly who built the structure?
We have some. They're very limited. There's no documentation that slaves were involved in building it. We have the names of...
there was no documentation that they weren't either, right?
Exactly.
Yes,
exactly.
okay.
We have the name of what was called then the building committee. There were 3 men on it. My sense is that everyone pitched in. That people donated lumber or sold lumber to build the church, and somehow, it's too bad we do not have the documentation. We have a few bills. We have David Hoadley's name on a bill, which is our very small documentation that he was involved.
Yes.
But we know he was, and for that group of people to build such a magnificent looking meeting house was quite a feat. So whoever built it, whoever oversaw all that, was very talented. Yeah.
You know, you've mentioned the people several times. Would you give our audience, if your research has provided it for you, a flavor of the types of people? Were they lawyers? Were they farmers? Who were these people?
That's a really good question, Jim. We'll start with 1818-ish.
Okay.
The ones that stayed in the West Avon section were more farmers. And the parish had just added more western lots to build on, so that population was going to grow of farmers. The Avon Congregational Church, like it is today, was more on the commercial strip. The Route 44 was an old highway that went all the way to Albany, New York, hence Albany Avenue. And there were, a little more what we would think of as businesses, and maybe a little more wealth to donate to the church in money and materials.
Which may explain why it's such a magnificent edifice.
Yeah. They didn't cut corners.
Yes, I've been there. It really is quite beautiful.
Yeah,
it
thank
really
you.
is.
Thank you.
Would you share with our viewing audience the overall picture that you've gotten of the church through your research?
Yeah.
What's your overall assessment or picture of it? Please.
One thought I had very recently, going through the records of the 1910s and 20s and 30s, 40s and 50s and 60s.
And by the way, excuse me, where are these records kept,
all right.
by the way?
The records are in our church archives.
Okay.
We have a room for them
Okay.
in cabinets, in locked things with files.
Fireproof?
No, sprinklers though.
Okay.
Fireproof cabinets were too heavy for the second floor.
Okay.
So we couldn't do that.
All right, yes.
And some are being digitized by the Avon Library.
Oh,
so
okay.
we're working to preserve things really well. So what were the people like?
Yeah, what were they like?
Yeah.
Give us a sense of those.
What I've learned is the church was the meeting house where it was the town hall. It was the biggest, along with the West Avon Church Hall. It was, the biggest room in town.
See, I think that's a very critical point that you raised that's missed. The church was the focal point of the community at that point.
Absolutely.
Not so much the way it is now, but it was major things, weddings, funerals, businesses, nothing. Those types of things went through the church.
Somewhat.
Okay.
Somewhat.
All right.
That's a whole nother topic.
Okay.
the minister's diary, who I feature in my book, he was always going to people's houses for weddings.
Okay.
And the funerals.
Okay.
It seemed, though, that baptisms were in the church, in the meeting house. But it was the house of meetings. And the church was the body of people who were members. Slightly different. And so think of it as the internet cafe, the gym, the social hall. It was everything. You wanted to see your friends, you went to church on Sundays. In sort of the earlier 1900s, you wanted to have your teenager be part of a group. They joined the youth fellowship. That was just where it all was. And there, most people didn't have the means to get out of town, or the cars, or the money to do things, and go into Hartford to do stuff. So it was the recreation, it was the worship, it was the social life.
What about the women of that period? What did your research reveal anything about women's participation in the construction of the church, or the design of the church, or the meetings? Certainly, meetings are run. Were they all male-dominated meetings, or?
Again, there's not a lot of documentation,
Okay.
but we certainly know all the ministers up until the 1940s were men.
Okay.
The women, I don't think, had a role at all, before that time in the services, as worship leaders. But they certainly kept that place going.
Absolutely.
They were the ones who were there every Sunday. They brought all the children. They served on all the committees. They served all
brought Pop to the church too.
They brought Pop and hubby, and
That's right.
they were at the chicken dinners, and they were making it.
They made the chicken.
They probably killed the chicken.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, I think the women had a huge role.
Yeah, behind the roles, but very critical part of making it what it is today.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, were the services interracial at all in the early years, or because when I went to your church, I saw the lower half and I saw the upper half, and some of my research has shown me that the upper half was for slaves to worship in the church. I remember Horace Bushnell in Hartford was constructed along those lines. So I didn't know if that was true of the Avon Church. Does your research speak to that?
It doesn't at all, and there's no documentation in our archives. I've read histories of Farmington and Avon, and it's not mentioned there. I know in the 1790 census of Avon, Farmington. We were part of Farmington.
Yes.
There were 5 slaves listed in the 1790 census. And I don't know exactly how that worked in the Farmington church, which was different buildings. And there's a whole other thing we could get into with the movements for abolition.
Sure, go ahead, talk about it if you wish.
In Rufus Hawley, who was the second minister of Avon, was, I think, an abolitionist. That word may not have come to him at that point because he died in 1826. But he was a subscriber for a book on anti-slavery. His name was in the book, meaning he, had helped pay for its publication. He was a pre-buyer of the book. He joined an anti-slavery society in Hartford in the 1790s.
In the 1790s?
In the 1790s.
Wow.
He had grown up and knew of friends, minister colleagues who had slaves.
Yes.
So he saw it, and wanted, I think, to do what he could against it. I've never seen one of his sermons, so I don't know how he preached on it. I do know that Noah Porter in Farmington, at the time of the Amistad.
Yes.
Move in the 1841,
yes.
when the 30 or 40 so Africans were able to come to Farmington.
Sure.
He took in some of them into his home and preached on abolition. even at a time when Farmington and presumably what's today Avon were split on it. You know, there were those pro and those against.
Sure, absolutely.
So
that was a constant thread through American history.
Yeah.
You know, it's so intertwined with our history on many different levels. And of course, the church is a central figure in that.
It is.
One way or the other.
And the United Church of Christ is known for its anti-slavery and women's rights. And you know, these ministers in those early days were part of what became the United Church of Christ. So I just think there was a tradition there where they would have supported abolition.
Nora, has your research surprised you and you found that maybe your church or churches that you've worked with were part of the Underground Railroad?
I think ours was, definitely.
You think the Avon Church was?
Yeah. The church...
Why don't you tell our audience what the Underground Railroad is? So.
Well, very brief.
Sure.
It's a mechanism, if you'd agree,
absolutely.
for bringing enslaved people from the South, giving them a safe haven on little stops along the way.
Absolutely.
And Farmington was well known for it.
Absolutely, which is why the Amistad people went there.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's a lot of documentation for that. But of course, the whole thing was supposedly secret, so it's hard to get the documentation.
Absolutely, yes.
And I have seen that Avon was considered, there were people in Avon who helped because we are north of Farmington. We're on a highway.
Absolutely.
So it would have made complete
It's all right there.
All made complete sense. And there was sort of a route over Deer Cliff Road that they used from going north from Farmington, and we're right below that. So I have no documentation in my own church, but I think, you know, we must have been.
Yeah, there may be some documentation in other churches that tie you to that.
Right.
Yes.
Or something that will come to light.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, Nora, many churches had cemeteries attached to them for burying the members, the pastors, and so forth. When I went to your church, I noticed there was a cemetery there.
Right.
I usually go cemetery reading to get a feel for the names of the people, and sometimes they put their professions on the headstones.
Yeah.
That cemetery that's attached to your church, would you talk a little bit about that, please?
That's called the East Avon Cemetery. It's not associated with our church. Burial grounds in those early days were separate organizations, even though we're like right next to each other. But we have pastors who are buried there, certainly many members, with fascinating gravestones. I learned on a tour a couple of weeks ago that our first pastor, when he died in 1829, he died on the same day as his daughter, which those are just, you know, that was part of his story. We have a Civil War soldier who was an African American who is buried there, and we know that he worked at our church. And the Avon Historical Society was able to get in touch with the descendants of his Civil War regiment. And it was an African American regiment, and they came like maybe 2 years ago to do a kind of a rededication, just an honored the gravestone in their Civil War uniforms.
Amazing.
Yeah, that was a wonderful moment.
Wow.
So, and then most recently in the last few weeks, I was given a gravestone by someone. I could lift it. It was like the size of a big book.
Yes.
And she said she found it by the dumpster in the parking lot years ago.
Oh, okay.
And so thank you very much. So we took it, and you could barely read anything on it.
Yeah.
And I thought, but we've got to figure this out. So I looked at it in different light, and finally a few words came out. And I was able to go to a wonderful website called findagrave.com. I plugged in the name that I saw, and then East Avon Cemetery, because I knew it came from right next door.
Yes, yes.
Up popped a picture of it having come apart from the main one. Someone took a picture of it.
Okay.
And then there was all the information about the family, which I also used Ancestry.com. So now we know all about this little gravestone fragment. And we can't put it back there, of course, because it would end up by the dumpster. But it's going to go to the Avon Historical Society.
Now, I believe there was a husband and wife team that co-pastored the church.
There was.
Would you talk about them, please,
Yep,
and their
I would.
longevity?
Sure. This was E. Jerome Johansson and his wife, Laura Lane Johansson, both congregational ministers. They went to Hartford Seminary together. This was in the 1940s.
Was she the first female?
She was. They went to Oxford University together in England. Very well educated.
Yes.
They had other pastorates. Then they came to us in the late 40s as co-pastors, which was very, I think, unusual. They apparently were very popular. People loved them. I have a newspaper clipping that said, welcome to the Johansons. Let's learn more about them. And of course, they have her in the kitchen, talking about motherhood. But that was the beginning. And then there are other pictures of her, in the robes preaching, and people really loved them.
Did your archives have any records of their sermons from the 40s?
Very little.
Okay.
Very little. And I keep finding things. And unfortunately, one of their ways of keeping records was to paste things in scrapbooks in the 20s and 30s and 40s. So a lot of what I have like half of it. The other half is pasted underneath.
Yeah.
But as I said, the library is scanning these right now, so that's awesome.
Now, let's pretend that you're talking to someone who was a member 200 years ago, and you're giving them a tour today. What do you think they'd find most fascinating about the church?
They would, I think, be fascinated to see things they'd recognize. The walls, the cornices. The layout would be different because there would have been box pews around the edges. There would have probably been a high pulpit. Not, if you remember, it was just a sort of a stage that we have today with a small.
It would have been a magisterially high
to climb
talking
up.
Down to the. Absolutely.
We have a documentation that there was one, and that the minister standing in that pulpit could look across to the choir, which was the second floor, as you saw.
That would be pretty high.
But that was taken out later, and the new configuration that you saw was put in. The people of 1819 would be shocked that it was warm inside. There was no heat. We're talking, they're visiting in the winter, okay? So
how quickly we forget, right?
Exactly.
Wow.
No electricity, of course. What's a woman doing in the pulpit? Because we have a new bridge minister right now that started last Sunday.
Okay, yes.
Of course, what are you all wearing? Your clothes look really strange. And I think the sounds outside would just be horrifying. The traffic, the airplanes. I think, I've often thought, what would happen if Reverend Rufus Hawley, the second pastor, came back? And I think he would he'd be happy to see the two churches still there, because he really gave birth to the two. But I think a lot of what he sees would just be so confounding.
Is Avon Congregational Church open and affirming?
Yes, it is.
And when did that happen?
That happened, I'm going to say 3 or 4 years ago, officially, by a vote of the congregation.
And would you tell our audience what that means?
What that means, as a very brief description, is that we are open to anyone on their faith journey to please come and be with us and worship and take part in programs, regardless of your age, sex, sexual orientation. That's the key one that most people assign that.
It's part of the UCC, isn't
it? Right. Yes. I think the UCC has its own its official definition.
Yes.
But it's really an openness to all people.
So what are some of the plans you have for the 200th anniversary? What are some of the things in store for Avon Congregational Church?
The one thing that is already underway is a joint book that I am compiling and writing with the West Avon Congregational Church. See, we are friends again.
Yes, you are.
But their history started when ours did. You know, with that fire, we both started our history as separate. But we thought for this, we wanted to get back together. And some of our history overlaps. Some of their staff would come to do programs at our church. So we have pictures that cross the border, kind of. And today, for years, we've done summer services together.
Okay.
You know, while each of our ministers is on vacation.
Okay.
So this joint book is I think, a big deal. It's
All right.
going to be filled with probably 200 plus vintage photographs.
Oh boy. Will it be for sale?
Yes, it will.
Okay.
And it'll be coming out in the summer of 2019.
All right.
Next year.
Very good.
And we have more photo collections being unearthed.
All right.
I'm a consultant on a collection that I just started last week with hundreds and hundreds of old Avon photographs that have never been seen before. So,
Terrific.
so we got that.
That's all the time we have for tonight's show. My thanks to my guest, Nora Howard, for sharing her story. Everybody has a story. What's yours? Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, good night.